Good evening and welcome. Before we set out, take a moment to settle in. Dim the lights, if you like. Put down whatever the day has left in your hands and let your breathing find its own slower pace. There is nothing here to keep up with and nothing you will be asked to remember. Tonight is a long, slow walk, and it will go on at its own gentle pace whether you stay for every step or drift away somewhere along the hedges. Either way is exactly right. That is what this hour is for. Tonight we are going to walk down a famous street. Not through a century this time, and not through the branches of a family tree, through a place. A small town on an island in Rhode Island where, in the space of about one generation at the end of the 1800s, the wealthiest families in America built the grandest summer houses this country has ever seen and called them, with perfectly straight faces, cottages. We will walk Bellevue Avenue in the dark, past the tall hedges and the iron gates. We will let ourselves into the great rooms one at a time, a hall of carved stone rising 45 feet, a ballroom sheathed in gold, a staircase shaped like a heart. And we will go below stairs as well, and up under the eaves, into the hidden house inside each house, where 40 servants kept the whole dream lit, because the truest history of these places was never in the ballrooms. It was in the corridors. Everything in tonight's story is real, as best as history can tell it. The marble is real, the parties were real, the loneliness was real, and the foghorn you will hear at the edge of things was real too, out past the cliffs, sounding all night, every night, exactly as it still does. So, let us begin where Newport itself begins. At the edge of the sea, at dusk. Picture a small town at the end of a summer day on an island at the edge of New England. The light is going amber over the harbor. Sailboats swing at their moorings, and the gulls are making their last slow circles above the wharves. Off to the south, where the open Atlantic begins, a bank of fog stands offshore the way it often does on a warm evening, a soft gray wall, waiting for the land to cool so that it can come in. When it comes, it will come quietly, up over the cliffs and across the great lawns, and somewhere out past the rocks a horn will begin to sound, patient as a heartbeat, and it will sound all night. This is Newport, Rhode Island. It is one of the strangest and loveliest places in American history. Strange because of the arithmetic. Newport today is a town of roughly 25,000 people. And scattered along its southern shore stands the greatest collection of grand private palaces ever built in this country. Houses of 70 rooms, houses of marble and gold, nearly all of them raised within a single generation, and nearly all of them used by the families who built them for only 6 or 8 weeks a year. To understand how such a thing came to be, it helps to know that Newport had already lived 2 whole lives before the millionaires ever arrived. The first life began in 1639, when a small band of settlers came down from Massachusetts, people who had been asked, more or less firmly, to leave because their ideas about religion did not fit. They founded a town on a principle radical for its century, that no one here would be persecuted for their faith, and it filled with the people who did not fit elsewhere, Quakers and Baptists and Jewish families from across the Atlantic, and it thrived. By the middle of the 1700s, Newport was, by some accounts, among the busiest seaports in the American colonies, its wharves handling rum and molasses and whale oil, its cabinet makers making pieces that stand in museums today. And it must be said plainly, even at this quiet hour, that a portion of that first fortune was made in the trade in enslaved human beings, a debt written into the town's oldest ledgers, and worth naming honestly whenever Newport's story is told. That first life ended with the Revolution. The British occupied the town for 3 years, half the population fled, and the trade moved to New York and never came back. And then something gently important happened, which is that nothing happened. For decades, Newport was too poor to grow and too poor to tear anything down, and the colonial town simply stood, shingled houses, steepled churches, narrow crooked streets, preserved by hard times sleeping beside its harbor. The second life came in with the sea air. In the early 1800s, doctors began prescribing ocean climate the way they prescribed medicine, and Newport's summers, cool, bright, 10 degrees kinder than the sweltering cities, acquired a reputation. First came planter families up from Charleston and Savannah to escape the southern heat. After them came a gentler invasion of writers and painters and professors, who built the first modest summer houses along the cliffs. It was in those years that people began calling a Newport summer house a cottage, and in those years the word was honest. The cottages were wooden and shingled, with deep porches and honeysuckle, and nobody's ballroom held 400 people, because nobody had a ballroom. Then the Civil War ended, the age of the great fortunes began, and the money found the island. It came by water, which was somehow fitting. Every evening, a steamer of the Fall River line, white-hulled, gilt-trimmed, lit up like a floating hotel, left its pier in Manhattan, ran east through the darkness of Long Island Sound, and put its passengers ashore early the next morning, so that a man could leave Wall Street at the close of business and wake to gulls and salt air. By the 1880s, Newport, cool, beautiful, compact, already faintly aristocratic, had become the summer capital of American wealth, the place where the greatest fortunes of the Gilded Age went to see one another and to be seen. And the seeing mattered because Newport's deepest advantage was its smallness. The whole stage was a few miles of shoreline, and above all, one long leafy street, where every arrival was noticed and every carriage recognized. On that street, over about 20 years, the richest families in America would conduct one of the most expensive conversations in history, a conversation held entirely in architecture. Let us go and walk it. It is full dark now, and the fog has come in the way it promised. Not thick, just a softness in the air that puts a halo around every lamp. Bellevue Avenue begins near the edge of the old colonial town and runs south for roughly 2 miles, until it bends at last toward the sea. Walk it slowly on the grass verge and let the town explain itself as it goes. The upper end of the avenue nearest town was the commercial end, though commerce here wore gloves. In season, the shops along this stretch were summer branches of New York jewelers and dressmakers. And here, behind a long shingled front, stands the Newport Casino, not a gambling house, despite the name, but a club of lawns and grass tennis courts, and the subject of the first story Newport likes to tell about itself. In 1879, the story goes, the publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr., a man famous for doing whatever occurred to him, dared a visiting English polo player to ride his horse up the steps of the Reading Room, the town's oldest and most solemn gentlemen's club. The Englishman did exactly that, clattering across the sacred porch, and in some tellings, straight into the front hall. The club was not amused. Privileges were revoked. And Bennett, in a sulk of truly magnificent proportions, answered by building a pleasure palace of his own across the street. The casino, opened in 1880, with the finest grass courts in America. The following summer, the first national tennis championship in the country's history was played on them, and for decades afterward, the last week of every August belonged to the tournament. Remember Tennis Week. The whole season was built to end on it. Walk on south, and the shops fall away, and the hedges begin. This is the thing visitors never quite expect about Bellevue Avenue, how little of it you can actually see. The great houses stand back behind walls of clipped privet and beech, 10 and 12 feet high, dense as masonry, kept by crews of gardeners to a flatness you could set a level against. Behind the hedges, gravel drives curve away toward porticos. At the street, gates of wrought iron, some with gilded tips that catch the lamplight, hang between stone posts, and beside the grander gates stand little porters' lodges, each built to hold a man whose entire purpose was to open the gate for the right people, and not for the wrong ones. The hedge, the gate, the lodge, before a single room of any cottage comes into view, the street has already said the one thing it was built to say. Not everyone comes in. The older houses appear first, the modest grandparents of everything that follows. Kingscote from 1841, all Gothic peaks and diamond-paned windows, wooden and painted and human-sized, one of the first houses in America built purely for summer pleasure. Then Château-sur-Mer from 1852, a mass of granite raised on China trade money, with towers and a great dark hall. For a whole generation, this was the grandest house in Newport, and its owners must have believed nothing would ever overtop it. They were mistaken beyond imagining. Because farther south, deeper in the fog, the stone generation is waiting, the palaces of the 1890s, standing along both sides of the avenue like ships of the line at anchor. The elms behind its wall and its beeches. Rosecliff, low and white and graceful. Marble House, cold and perfect as a temple. Beechwood, where a queen held court, and Bell Court, where a rebel moved when she was done with marble. And off to the east, at the end of a quieter lane, on a point of land above the open ocean, the greatest of them all, the Breakers, with its back to the street and its face to the sea. Listen for a moment before we go through any gate. Leaves moving in the hedge tops. Gravel settling. The horn far off keeping its slow time. And underneath everything, more felt than heard, the long rhythm of the ocean against the base of the cliffs. The people who built these houses heard exactly this on their last night of every summer, and it has not changed at all. The houses behind these hedges were called cottages. It is worth pausing before any door opens on that single strange word. The joke was old, and everyone was in on it. A cottage, in the Newport sense, was any summer residence whatsoever, and by the 1890s the word was being applied, without a flicker of irony left in it, to houses of 50 and 60 and 70 rooms, built of limestone and marble by the same architects who built banks and libraries and monuments. Calling such a building a cottage was in its way the most exclusive joke in America. If it needed explaining to you, the joke was on you. But inside the joke there is a fact, and the fact is stranger than the joke. These enormous houses really were used the way a cottage is used. The Newport season ran roughly 8 weeks, July and August, with a soft opening in late June and a hard stop after tennis week. For those 8 weeks, a great cottage blazed, every bedroom aired, every servant on station, fresh flowers in 40 rooms, an orchestra on Saturday nights. For the other 10 months it stood dark, shuttered, sheeted, drained, and silent, with a caretaker's lantern crossing the lawn at dusk and just enough heat in the pipes to keep the painted ceilings from cracking. A house that cost, by some accounts, $11 million, delivering perhaps 56 nights of residence a year. There has never been anything quite like it, before or since. The reasonable question is what these houses were for, and the answer is that they were not primarily buildings at all. They were positions. American society in the Gilded Age was a war of old money against new, the settled families of New York against the flood of industrial fortunes, railroad money and silver money and coal money, pressing against the drawing room doors. In winter, the war was fought in the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue. But summer gathered everyone onto this one small island, onto this one leafy street where every fortune in America could inspect every other fortune at close range. And there, a cottage was a claim, made in limestone, that could not be shouted down. You might dispute a family's manners. You could not dispute 70 rooms of cane stone standing above the sea. And it matters for everything that follows tonight to say who the commanders in this war actually were. Not, for the most part, the men. The husbands of Newport spent their weekdays in New York at the banks and the railroad offices and came up on the Friday evening boat. There was a name, the weekend husbands, for the whole tribe of them. On weekdays, Newport was a town of women, children, and servants. The wives planned the campaigns, built the houses, drew the guest lists, and decided between them who existed and who did not. In an age that allowed capable women almost no other theater, no vote, no office, no profession worth the name, the season was the one great game they were permitted to play, and they played it, by every account, with the seriousness of generals. At the head of them all stood one small, dignified figure, Caroline Astor of the old Knickerbocker aristocracy, who summered on this very avenue at a dark wooden cottage called Beechwood, and whose approval was, quite simply, the currency the entire war was fought over. We will come back to her, and to her famous list of 400 names, when we sit down to dinner in a few chapters' time. One more thing before the first gate opens, because it belongs to the honest ledger of the street. All of this, the hedges, the marble, the 8 blazing weeks, rested on the town beneath it. The season was Newport's harvest. Grocers, florists, liverymen, laundresses, the men who raked the gravel, and the boys who held the horses, much of the town earned its whole year in those 2 months, and ate well that winter when the great houses did well. The palaces were absurd, and the town depended on the absurdity, and both of those things were true at once. Now come east, off the avenue, down a quieter lane toward the sound of the ocean. There are gates ahead of us, 30 feet of wrought iron under the fog. Behind them stands the grandest summer house ever built in America. The house on Oakley Point exists because of a fire. There was an earlier breakers on this ground, a big, rambling, wooden summer house named for the waves that break on the rocks below the cliff, which Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the old Commodore, had bought in the 1880s. In November of 1892, with the season over and the house standing empty, it burned. And Cornelius, a famously serious and methodical man, gave his architect 2 instructions that tell you nearly everything about him. The new house must be fireproof, and it must be finished quickly. The architect was Richard Morris Hunt, the great house builder of the age, and what he raised on the cliff between 1893 and 1895 was a 70-room palazzo in the manner of the merchant palaces of Genoa, but built like no palace Genoa ever saw. Its bones are steel and brick and limestone. There is in the structure itself essentially no wood to burn. And the great heating boilers, the open fires that had eaten the first breakers, were banished from the building altogether, buried in a chamber out beneath the front lawn, hundreds of feet away, connected to the house by an underground tunnel, so that no furnace flame would ever again live under a Vanderbilt roof. Picture that detail on a winter night, the lawn silent and white, and far below it, a room of fires faithfully warming a palace that nobody was home in. Guests entered through those 30-foot gates, up a curve of raked gravel, through bronze and glass doors, and into one of the most astonishing rooms in America, the Great Hall, rising roughly 45 feet through the middle of the house in carved can stone the color of pale honey. It is an Italian courtyard turned indoors, and on bright days it fills with sea light because the far wall looks straight out over the lawn to the open Atlantic. The materials had crossed that same ocean: French limestone, Italian and African marbles, rose alabaster for the columns of the dining room, a 2-story room dripping with gilt where the family dined beneath a painted goddess of the dawn. The music room, walls and ceiling entire, was built in Paris by the firm of Allard, taken apart, shipped across in crates, and reassembled by French craftsmen. And in the corner that catches the morning sun there is a small, quiet marvel, the morning room, whose panels, painted with the muses, are covered not in gold leaf but in platinum, a metal that will never tarnish, chosen so that the room's soft silver light would outlast everyone who sat in it. It has. The house was modern in ways its skin concealed. It was wired for electricity and piped for gas both, because electricity was still young and the family hedged its bets. The bathrooms ran hot and cold water, fresh and salt, seawater pumped up from the ocean for bathing, and one tub on the second floor was carved from a single block of marble, so deep it had to be filled twice with hot water on cold mornings before the stone stopped stealing the heat. Below stairs ran the other house, the vast kitchen, the pantries, the wine cellars, the servants' dining hall, staffed in season by roughly 40 people. We will spend a whole chapter down there before the night is over. The mistress of all this was Alice Vanderbilt, Alice of the Breakers, as society called her. She was devout, exacting, and formidably disciplined, and she ran the house like a well-officered ship. Each morning in a small office off her rooms, she reviewed the day with her housekeeper and her chef, the menus, the guest lists, the flowers, the failures. Nothing in 70 rooms escaped her. On Sundays, the household went quiet for church, and she held the whole gilded apparatus to a standard of propriety that made the Breakers, for all its splendor, one of the more sober great houses on the island. And here is the quiet human fact at the center of the grandest cottage in America. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the man who ordered it fireproof and fast, the hardest working member of his generation, barely got to live in it. The house opened in the summer of 1895, with a ball for his daughter's debut. Within about a year, worn down by work and by a bitter family quarrel over a son's marriage, he suffered a stroke, and he died in 1899 in his mid-50s. The fireproof palace by the sea had been his for 4 summers. Alice never remarried. She kept the Breakers, sheets on, sheets off, season after season, for another 35 years, and when she died in 1934, it passed to her daughter Gladys, who will matter again at the end of our story. Back now to the avenue and south a little way through the fog. There is a house down here that was given as a birthday present. It is smaller than the Breakers, and colder and prouder, and in its way it is the most defiant building in America. Alva Vanderbilt was born Alva Erskine Smith in Mobile, Alabama, and came into the family by marrying William Kissam Vanderbilt, another of the old Commodore's grandsons. She was small, iron-willed, and burningly intelligent, and she had discovered in New York the great insight of her career, that in the war for social position, architecture was artillery. Her white chateau on Fifth Avenue had forced old society's doors open a decade before. Newport was to be her second front. And for it, with the same Richard Morris Hunt, she conceived something beyond a house. A temple. Marble House was built in secrecy behind board fences, the workmen, by some accounts, sworn not to describe what they were making. When it was unveiled, finished in 1892, presented by William to Alva as a gift for her 39th birthday, Newport understood why. Facing the street stands a portico of great Corinthian columns, modeled on the garden temples of Versailles. The little palace of Marie Antoinette is usually named, executed not in painted wood, like honest American architecture, but in white marble, acres of it. The figures that circulated, from the family's own telling, were $11 million all told, of which some $7 million was marble alone, 500,000 cubic feet, cut, shipped, carved, and polished by artisans brought from Europe. Inside, the house is cool, correct, and overwhelming, deliberately so. The entrance hall is yellow sienna marble, glowing faintly like the inside of amber. There is a Gothic room, built to hold Alva's collection of medieval carvings and altarpieces, dim and jeweled as a chapel. And then there is the ballroom, the gold room, and there is nothing else quite like it in this country. Every surface is carved wood and gilded metal covered in gold leaf, gold upon gold upon gold, with mirrored panels set between so that the gilding reflects itself into infinity. By electric light, it is merely dazzling. By candlelight, and Alva entertained by candlelight, the walls did not seem lit so much as slowly burning, and the dancers moved inside the glow like figures inside a lamp. Her daughter would remember the whole house, in a memoir written half a century later, as magnificent and cold, a museum one happened to sleep in. Alva would probably not have minded the description. Museums, after all, are permanent. She gave the house 3 years of triumph. And then in 1895, she did the unthinkable. She divorced. Divorce, at her altitude of society, was close to social suicide. A divorced woman was expected to withdraw, go quiet, disappear into Europe. Alva divorced William on grounds of his infidelity, kept Marble House in the settlement, kept her children and her head high, and within the year had married again. Oliver Belmont, a friend and neighbor, and moved down the avenue to his house, Belcourt. Society gasped, wavered, and then, because she was Alva, mostly fell back in line. She had broken the cardinal rule and survived, though the survival cost her things that do not show from the street. We will meet the largest of those costs at an upstairs window of this very house a few chapters from now. Marble House itself, she simply closed. For years the temple stood dark, furniture sheeted, gold room shuttered, gates chained, a perfect $11 million ghost in the middle of the brightest street in America. And then in her widowhood, Alva did the last thing anyone expected. She reopened the house for politics. In her 60s, she had found the cause of her life, votes for women. The great hall that had received the 400 now received suffrage rallies and lecture meetings. Tickets were sold to the public, who streamed at last through gates built to keep them out, and on the cliff edge behind the house she raised a painted Chinese tea house, where, by some accounts, the cups and saucers were printed with the words, "Votes for Women." The woman who had built a temple to win a social war rearmed it, in old age, for a political one. That war was won in 1920. Alva had, in her grand way, helped. 2 doors up the avenue there is a very different house, younger, lighter, built not for defiance but for pleasure, by a woman whose money came out of a hole in the ground in Nevada. It has the loveliest staircase in America and one of the saddest endings. Let us go there next. The money behind Rosecliff was silver. Teresa Fair, Tessie, all her life to everyone, was the daughter of James Graham Fair, an Irish immigrant who went west with nothing and struck it almost unimaginably rich in the Comstock Lode, the great silver bonanza of Nevada. Mining money, saloon and boomtown money, by the standards of Mrs. Astor's drawing room, about as new as money could be. Tessie married Herman Ulrichs, a well-placed shipping man, arrived in Newport in the 1890s and set about the ancient project of the newly arrived, building her way in. The land she bought came with a gentle pedigree and a lovely name. An earlier house on the site had belonged to George Bancroft, the great historian of the United States, who spent his summers writing history and breeding roses on this ground. The stories say the American Beauty rose itself came out of his garden, and the name of his place was Rosecliff, and Tessie kept it. For her architect, she chose the most fashionable and charming man in the profession, Stanford White, and told him, in effect, to build her a house for parties. White gave her a low, graceful palace of white-glazed terracotta, modeled on the Grand Trianon at Versailles, finished in 1902 at a cost by some accounts of around $2.5 million, the least fortress-like of the great cottages, all long arched windows and garlands of carved roses, a house that looks, in the fog tonight, like a pavilion made of moonlight. 2 things inside it explain everything. The first is the ballroom, 40 feet by 80, the largest in Newport, with tall arched doors on both long sides, so that on a warm night the party could dissolve straight outward onto the terraces and the sea air. The second is the staircase. It rises from the hall in a single sweep that divides and curls back on itself, and its plan looked at from above is the shape of a heart. It is often called the loveliest staircase in America, and it was engineered for exactly one thing: a woman in a gown descending slowly, seen from below. This house was built for the entrance, the dance, and the warm night, and for nothing else whatsoever. Tessie ran it like a theater and scrubbed it like a farm wife. She was famous on the island as the most exacting housekeeper in Newport, and by some accounts she would tie on an apron and get down on her knees beside her own maids when the marble wanted scrubbing. Her masterpiece came in August of 1904, the Bal Blanc, the white ball. Everything white, white gowns commanded of every lady, white flowers banked in every room, powdered white hair in the old French style, white candles doubled in the mirrors. And offshore, in the dark beyond the cliff, floated the touch that Newport never forgot, a little fleet of full-sized mock ships, painted white, riding at anchor where the guests on the terrace could see them, a phantom armada on the black water. By some accounts, there were a dozen. By all accounts, nobody who stood on that terrace ever forgot them. The white palace, the music drifting toward the water, the beautiful crowd, this house became the template. 70 years later, when Hollywood needed to photograph the world of The Great Gatsby, the filmmakers came here, and the ball gown scenes of the 1974 film were made at Rosecliff. When America tries to picture its own gilded dream, it pictures, whether it knows it or not, Tessie's house. A gentle word in passing about the man who built it: Stanford White did not live to grow old. His death, a few years after Rosecliff was finished, was one of the great scandals of that age, and we will leave it folded away tonight, as one leaves a newspaper on the far table. Tessie's own ending belongs to the house. Herman died in 1906. The parties went on, then thinned, then ceased. And in her last years, she died at Rosecliff in 1926. The stories say that her mind loosened its moorings, and that she would sometimes move through the white ballroom, giving orders for a great party that was never to be held: the flowers, the music, the guests who were not coming. If the story is true, it is not a ghost story. It is only what happens when a person builds her whole life into 8 weeks a year, and the weeks stop coming. The house has never blamed her. Houses keep their staircases ready. Every candle at the Bal Blanc, every white ship, every scrubbed step of that heart-shaped stair was produced by hands we have not yet met. It is time to meet them. Come back up the avenue to the house with the wall and the beech trees. And this time we will not go in through the front door. We will go in the way the coal went in. Underneath. The Elms was built on coal, and it ran on coal, and the coal is the way to understand it. Its builder, Edward Julius Berwind, the son of German immigrants in Philadelphia, had built one of the great coal enterprises of the age. Berwind Coal, by some accounts, fired the boilers of the United States Navy and a fair share of the era's steamships and railroads besides. He was new money even by Newport standards, and he does not seem to have lost a minute of sleep over it. For his cottage, he passed over the famous names and chose a young, largely self-taught Philadelphian, Horace Trumbauer, who modeled the house on a French chateau of the 1700s, the Chateau d'Asnières outside Paris, and delivered it in 1901 for, by some accounts, around $1.5 million. It is perhaps the most quietly perfect of the cottages, a long, pale, beautifully mannered French house in gardens of fountains and marble pavilions, under weeping beeches now more than a century old. But the true genius of the Elms is not what you see. It is what you were never supposed to see. Berwin's instruction was that the machinery of the house should be invisible, that no guest strolling those gardens should ever lay eyes on a delivery wagon, a coal sack, a clothesline, or a servant carrying anything heavy. And so Trumbauer built two houses in one. The visible house is all French serenity. The invisible house begins at a discreet opening near the street, where coal was delivered down a chute into an underground tunnel that runs beneath the lawn. Along that tunnel, on rails, servants pushed carts of coal to the cellars, where great boilers made steam heat, and, a marvel for the year 1901, the house generated its own electricity. The Elms blazed with electric light from the day it opened, with not a wire nor a whiff of smoke to be seen from the rose gardens. Down in that same underworld were ice-making machines, wine cellars, a silver vault, laundries, and the long kitchen with its black iron ranges. And on the wall of the basement corridor hung the nerve center of everything, the call board, a panel of numbered bells and little flags, wired to every important room above. A pull beside a fireplace in the drawing room set a flag trembling downstairs, and somebody went, at a walk that was nearly a run, to answer it. Look up at the Elms from the lawn, and it appears to be a house of 2 stories crowned by a stone balustrade and a flat roof. That balustrade is a screen. Behind it, invisible from the ground, runs a whole 3rd floor of plain bedrooms, under the eaves iron bedsteads, washstands, small windows, where the female staff slept. That hidden floor, and the tunnel, and the callboard are the honest architecture of the Gilded Age, a design whose whole ambition was to make 40 working people vanish. So let us unvanish them, with the dignity they earned. In season, a house like this ran on a staff of roughly 40. Indoors, Two chains of command, the butler over the men, the housekeeper over the maids, and the chef, French, expensive, sovereign in his kitchen, answering to no one but the lady of the house. Beneath them, an exact hierarchy, the lady's maid and the valet, parlor maids and chambermaids, kitchen maids and the scullery girl, whose hands were in hot water from morning to night, laundresses, a hall boy, often 12 or 14 years old. Footmen, by some accounts, were hired in matched pairs for height and bearing because a tall footman was an ornament and was paid like one. Outside coachmen and later chauffeurs, grooms, and a dozen gardeners. Most were immigrants or their children. Irish and Swedish and English names fill the old registers, and positions were passed along like heirlooms, sister recommending sister, cousin bringing over cousin. Their day began around 5 in the morning, before any bell had a chance to ring. Kitchen fires lit, bread started, grates raked and blacked, boots and shoes, collected from outside every bedroom door the night before, polished and returned before their owners woke. Then the long choreography of a Newport day, breakfast, luncheon, calls, tea, and at the summit of it a formal dinner requiring nearly the whole indoor staff in motion at once. The last footman locked up long after midnight, and at 4 in the morning, in the low corridor under the roof, there was nearly always someone awake. A kitchen maid rising early, a laundress finishing, a girl writing a letter home by lamplight. Wages, told without either romance or contempt. A housemaid might earn roughly $300 to $400 a year, with room and board and uniforms found, steady, respectable money for an immigrant girl of that era, better than the mill. The hours were long, the ceilings were low, and the bells were absolute. It was hard work done to an exacting standard. By professionals, many stayed with one family for decades, proud of a house that ran, as they said, like silk. Their skill is in these walls as surely as the architects, and at the elms at least the old records keep their names, which is its own quiet kind of monument. All of that labor, the tunnel, the bells, the 5 o'clock fires, existed to manufacture a single product. 8 weeks of flawless summer. Let us watch one season run from the first boat of July to the last dance of August. A Newport season began before the families ever arrived. In the last weeks of June, the advance parties came up by boat. Housekeepers, footmen, maids, and the great houses opened their eyes one by one. Dust sheets folded away, chandeliers unbagged and washed crystal by crystal, silver up from the bank vaults, awnings rigged, gravel raked, hothouse flowers ordered by the 100 dozen. Then, in the first days of July, the white steamers began delivering the families themselves, and the machine engaged. The mornings belonged to a ritual that now takes some explaining, because the world it governed is gone. Calling. In the late morning and early afternoon, the ladies of Newport went out in open carriages, each with a small case of engraved cards, her name, nothing more, and drove from gate to gate. At each door, a footman presented the card on a silver tray. If the lady of the house was at home to you, you went in for a visit of 15 minutes, never longer. If she was not at home, and not at home was a message, not a fact, you left your card and drove on. A card returned promptly meant the acquaintance was welcome. A card unreturned season after season was a door closed with perfect politeness. Corners could be folded by some accounts to carry particular meanings: condolence, farewell, a visit made in person. No voice was ever raised, and everyone understood everything. It was the quietest battlefield in American history. Above the whole system sat the list. Caroline Astor, Mrs. Astor, as if there were only one, governed society with the help of a courtly Southern gentleman named Ward McAllister, her chamberlain and enforcer. It was McAllister who remarked to a newspaper in 1888 that there were really only about 400 people in fashionable New York society. And the number stuck, helped along by the story, polished ever since, that 400 was simply the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. The 400 became the most famous guest list in the world. To be on it was to exist. To be left off it was to summer in a marble palace on the most fashionable street in America and be, socially speaking, invisible. Newport in August was where the list breathed, where it showed, dinner by dinner, exactly who was in, who was rising, and who had quietly ceased to be asked. And the dinners were the engine of it all. Picture one at 8 o'clock in the gilded dining room of any house on this street. 10 courses, perhaps 3 hours. Oysters, a clear consommé, fish, then terrapin, a rich turtle stew that was the great delicacy of the age, then canvasback duck, a sweet Roman punch to rest the palate, then the roast, salads, ices, fruit, and coffee. Gold plate, a footman behind every second or third chair, the chef below stairs conducting his kitchen like an orchestra pit, the flowers on the table worth, by some accounts, more than a workman earned in a season. A hostess was judged on every plate, every wine, every seating. Precedence at table was a science, and a guest seated wrongly was an insult that could echo for a year. Multiply that dinner by 8 weeks, add the balls, the musicals, the champagne picnics, and the arithmetic arrives, by some accounts, at several $100,000 for a single family's single season. In the money of the 1890s, when $400 a year was a housemaid's honest wage. The whole age is folded into that ratio, and we can leave it there, folded, without a sermon. Toward the end of the era, the competition curdled gently into spectacle. When every hostess commanded the same chefs and the same gold plate, novelty became the only currency left, and the stories from those years grow strange, none stranger than the dinner, still told all over Newport, at which the guests of honor were dogs, society's lapdogs, by some accounts 100 of them, dining formally on delicacies while their owners looked on. The stories say it happened. Some details have been polished past checking. And the newspapers of the day had begun reporting such things in a new and dangerous tone, not awe anymore, but mockery. Out in the country, where a housemaid's wage was well understood, people read those accounts and drew their own conclusions. Every season crested the same way. Tennis week, the last week of August, at the casino, grass courts, striped awnings, the whole gilded world gathered in one green rectangle for the national championship. It was the grand finale and the closing ceremony at once. And when the last match ended, the entire apparatus, the calls, the cards, the 10-course evenings, had perhaps a week to live before the boats began carrying it away. But before we watch the houses close, we must climb one more staircase. Because all summer long, above the dinners and the diplomacy, on the plain third floors that the guests never saw, there were children listening through the floorboards. The cottages belonged to them too, and they paid in some ways the steepest rents of anyone. The geography of a Gilded Age childhood was vertical. Marble and gold on the first floor, silk on the second, and then up a plainer staircase, the nursery floor, painted iron beds, scrubbed pine, a rocking horse, a governess's room alongside. Children in the great cottages lived at the top of the house and came down in the main by appointment. The daily audience was the tea hour. Brushed, dressed, and delivered by the governess to the drawing room, a child would be presented to its mother, and to whatever guests were calling, for conversation, inspection, and affection, and then returned upstairs. Many parents of that world loved their children dearly. The world simply organized that love into a schedule. Breakfast with the governess, lessons in French, walks and ponies at fixed hours, the beach at the proper morning hour, and always, drifting up through the floorboards at night, the sound of the orchestra and the sea. In their memoirs, and that generation left many, the cottage children remember Newport with a strange double exposure. The island itself they remember as paradise, the ponies, the rocks, the smell of cut grass and salt. The houses they remember as beautiful and cold, museums with bedtimes. Freedom was the strip of lawn beyond the terrace, the cliff path, the sea. And for the daughters, the season had a purpose that nobody troubled to hide. A Newport summer was, among its other functions, a marriage market, the most rarefied in the world. The stakes were plain, an American fortune on one side, and on the other, very often, a European title attached to a great house in need of a roof. The newspapers had a name for the brides, dollar princesses, And by some counts, 100 or more American heiresses crossed the Atlantic in those decades to marry into the European aristocracy, taking with them dowries that ran in total to tens of millions. Some of those marriages turned out kindly. Many were exactly as warm as the arithmetic that arranged them. One of them happened here, and we owe it its telling. In the summer of 1895 at Marble House, Alva's daughter Consuelo was 18, tall, gentle, and, by her own later account, secretly in love with an American gentleman named Winthrop Rutherford, to whom she considered herself promised. Alva had other plans, and the plans had a name: the 9th Duke of Marlborough, master of Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest and hungriest houses in England. What followed, Consuelo herself described half a century later in her memoir. She was, in effect, confined to Marble House, her letters watched, her callers screened at the porter's lodge, the gates that tonight stand open to tourists standing closed, that August around a girl of 18. She wrote that she felt like a prisoner in her mother's marble, and from her room she could watch the one thing in Newport that was free, which was the sea. Alva pressed, with rage, with tears, with, by Consuelo's account, a sudden illness that may or may not have been diplomatic, and the girl, worn down, gave way. The engagement was announced that autumn. They were married in New York that November. She wrote long after that she wept behind her veil. The marriage did what such marriages did. It re-roofed Blenheim with railroad money, produced 2 sons, and made no one happy. It ended years later in an annulment at which Alva herself testified that she had forced her daughter into the match, an extraordinary admission, made in part to set Consuelo fully free. And freedom, in the end, is how the story softens. Consuelo married again for love, a French aviator named Jacques Balsan, and by every account, including her own, was happy at last. Mother and daughter reconciled, the suffrage years mellowed Alva into something like an ally, and Consuelo outlived the whole world of her girlhood, dying in 1964, one of the last people who could remember what the music in the Gold Room had actually sounded like. Her window is still there on the 2nd floor of Marble House, facing the Atlantic. The tour guides pointed out gently most afternoons. The sons of the cottages had their own quieter confinements, boarding school, the correct college, the seat on a board that was waiting whether or not they wanted it. Their cages were larger and better upholstered, and history has spent less sympathy on them, perhaps rightly. But of all the people the season commanded, hostesses, footmen, chefs, debutantes, the children were the only ones who had never signed up for it. They inherited the 8 weeks as one inherits weather. And like everyone else on this street, they watched the weather end the same way every year, with trunks in the halls, and September coming in off the sea. It ended fast every year. Within days of the last match of tennis week, the avenue filled with baggage wagons, and the wharves filled with trunks, and the evening boats to New York went out heavy. The families left first. The houses took longer to fall asleep, and the falling asleep was its own profession, performed by the staff in the quiet after the owners had gone. And it is such a peaceful piece of work that we will walk through it slowly, room by room, because there may be no better lullaby in this whole story. The flowers went first, out of 40 rooms, armload by armload. Then the silver, counted against the ledger, wrapped in flannel, crated, and carried down to the vaults of the bank in town for the winter. The chandeliers were bagged in muslin, each one becoming a pale, soft ghost of itself against the ceiling. The gilt chairs, the sofas, the long mirrors, sheeted, one by one, until each great room stood transformed into a landscape of white dunes. Carpets came up, were beaten on lines behind the service wing one last time, and were rolled with cedar shavings against the moths. The piano was closed and covered. In the kitchen, the ranges were blacked and left cold. The ice machines were stopped. The larders emptied down to nothing. Water was drained from the pipes against the coming frost. The boilers were banked low or put out. The gas was shut at the main, and the shutters, Hundreds of them, in a house of 70 rooms, were swung closed and latched, so that the sea light which had filled the halls all summer arrived one morning and was not let in. And here is the detail to keep, the one that says everything. In some houses at the very end, the clocks were simply allowed to run down. Nobody would be there to win them. One by one, over the days after the family left, the ticking stopped in room after room until the whole house held no time at all, only weather, and the sound of the sea coming faintly through the shutters. Then the last of the staff locked the service door, walked down the back drive, and took the boat south. What remained was the caretaker, a man, often with his family living in the lodge by the gate, whose winter was a round of small vigilances. The lantern crossing the lawn on a December night, the slow walk through sheeted ballrooms in work boots, checking for leaks, for frost, for the sea's fine salt dust on the windowsills. The only dancer of the off-season, moving through the white rooms with a lamp. The town, meanwhile, exhaled. The tradesmen tallied the season's accounts. The hedges kept growing whether anyone watched them or not, and the foghorn, which had spent all summer as background music to orchestras, got the nights back to itself. September light is different on Bellevue Avenue. It comes in low and gold through the shutter slats of empty houses and lies in bars across the sheeted furniture, and dust hangs in it, turning slowly, with no one to disturb it until spring. Every year, in other words, the great houses practiced being empty. It came to nothing year after year, because every June they woke again. But it was a rehearsal, though nobody meant it as one. A longer September was coming, one that would last for some of these houses half a century. Let us follow them into it, gently. No single blow ended the world of the cottages. It ended the way a tide goes out, several slow forces, all pulling the same direction, none of them dramatic in any given year. Some will be familiar if you have spent other evenings by this fireside. Here is how they came ashore on this particular street. The first force arrived by mail. In 1913, the federal income tax, in 1916, the estate tax, and within a few years, a world war hurries such things. The top rates had climbed to heights the builders of these houses could never have imagined. A cottage that consumed a few $100,000 a year had been a trifle to men whose incomes were untaxed. It was arithmetic of a different color now. The second force was quieter and deeper. The servants stopped coming. The war pulled the young women of the servant class into shops and offices and factories, and when it ended, they did not come back. The wages of service doubled, by some accounts, and still the agencies had no one to send. A 70-room house is not a house without 40 people to run it. It is a problem. So the 20s on this street were bright but thinner. Fewer houses opening each June, fewer lights along the cliffs, and then came 1929 and the 30s, and the pretending stopped. In 1932, deep in the Depression, Alva sold Marble House, the $11 million temple, for, by some accounts, roughly 1 cent on the dollar. She died in Paris the following year, unrepentant about everything. In September of 1938, a great hurricane came up the coast with almost no warning and drove the sea across the low parts of town. Rhode Island suffered terribly that day, and along the cliffs it carried away the little bathing pavilions of the old gilded shore, as if tidying them off a table. Then the Second War made Newport a Navy town, gray hulls in the bay where the white fleet of the Bal Blanc had floated, the avenue dark for the duration. And when that war ended, the reckoning arrived. In the market of 1946, a Gilded Age cottage was very nearly worthless. It could not be staffed, could not be heated, could not be sold, worth less in most cases than the bare land under it. So the wreckers came. Through the middle of the century, by some counts, dozens of Newport's great houses were demolished, or burned, or stripped and abandoned, and others survived only by changing their souls. Or Court, the limestone chateau next door to the breakers, was given away outright in 1947 to a Catholic religious order and became the heart of a college, so that today students carry book bags up a gilded staircase built for the 400. Of the fates on offer in those years, that was among the kindest. The rescue, when it came, began at a kitchen table. In 1945, a circle of Newport women, Catherine Warren's name leads the list, founded the Preservation Society of Newport County on the unfashionable conviction that these white elephants were irreplaceable works of art. Their first purchase, fittingly, was not a palace at all but a colonial merchant's house down by the harbor, Hunter House, as if the town were saving its oldest life first. Then in 1948 came the turning point. Gladys, Alice's daughter, the Countess, who had inherited the breakers and loved it, and who could no longer carry a 70-room house in the world of income taxes and vanished servants, leased the greatest cottage in America to the little society for $1 a year and opened it to the public. The public came. The public, it turned out, had always wanted to see. After that, one by one, the houses were gathered in. The Elms came within weeks of the wrecking ball, sold at auction in 1962, its furniture scattered, demolition scheduled, and the society raised the money and bought it, by some accounts for barely more than $100,000. Marble House was acquired the following year with the help of the family that had bought it from Alva. Rosecliff was given outright in 1971, donated with an endowment to sustain it by the New Orleans family who owned it last. And in 1972, the society bought the breakers itself, the price by some accounts a few $100,000 for a house that had cost $7 million to build in the money of 1895. The houses that could no longer be homes were allowed to become memory. It was not the future anyone had planned for them. It may be the kindest future available to a palace. Which brings us, quietly with the fog thick now and the night far along, back up the avenue one last time to see what all of this looks like tonight. Walk the avenue north the way we came. The hedges are still here, still 12 feet, still clipped. The gates are still here, iron tips catching the lamplight. And behind them the great houses stand tonight exactly as we have walked them. The breakers dark on its point above the sea, Marble House pale behind its columns, Rosecliff low and white, the elms silent above its buried tunnel. They are cared for now the way museums are cared for, small sensors watching the humidity where footmen once stood, velvet ropes waiting in the halls. In the morning there will be buses and guides and hundreds of strangers moving slowly through Alice's great hall with their faces turned up. The Breakers is, by most measures, the most visited place in Rhode Island, and the crowds that file through it each year number in the hundreds of thousands. Mrs. Astor's list, for the record, held 400. And the tour has widened in a way that would have astonished everyone in this story. Visitors today are led below stairs as carefully as above, through the kitchens, past the call board with its numbered bells, up under the balustrade of the elms to the plain bedrooms behind the screen, and the guides speak the servants' names, where the records have kept them, with the same care they give the millionaires. The invisible house has been made visible. The history of these places now belongs to everyone who lived in them, which is to say that it has finally become true. One more thing belongs to everyone, and it is the best-kept secret of the whole street. Along the ocean edge of all the great lawns, between the grass and the drop to the rocks, runs a public footpath, the Cliff Walk. It follows an old right-of-way, older than any fortune here, kept open by the fishermen of this island, who had walked the shore for generations and did not stop because palaces arrived. Some of the cottage owners, by some accounts, tried quietly to close it and failed, the fisherman's right held. And so tonight and every night, anyone at all may walk for miles along the sea hem of America's least public street, with the waves on one side and the gilded windows on the other, paying nothing, asking no one. The most democratic footpath in the country runs along the bottom of its most exclusive lawns. The sea, as the children of the cottages always knew, does not keep a list. Stand there a moment at the edge in the dark. Below, the breakers are working the rocks, the same waves that named the house, the same sound Alice heard through the shutters, and the caretaker on his winter rounds, and a girl at a window in the summer of 1895. The foghorn is out there too, patient as ever, keeping its slow time. Moonlight, where the fog thins, lies along the marble the way it has since 1892. The gulls are asleep. The town is asleep. The houses are used to this. Of all the things in our story, the houses were always best at night. So let it all settle now, gently, wherever it wants to settle. The hedges and the gates, the platinum panels in the gold room, the coal carts rolling under the lawn, the white ships riding at anchor in the dark, the calling cards on their silver trays, the clocks running down in September, the lantern crossing the winter grass. If you are still awake, you know the secret of the cottages now. They were never really homes. They were a brief, blazing argument about belonging, 8 weeks a year for about 40 years, and the argument ended in the gentlest way imaginable, with the gates standing open, the strangers welcomed in, and the sea still turning over, below the lawns, for everyone. And if you are drifting, half in and half out, letting the words blur into the sound of the water, that is exactly as it should be. The houses are used to being slept in lightly. There is nothing more to keep track of tonight and nowhere else to be. The avenue is quiet. The great rooms are sheeted and safe. The horn will keep the watch. Thank you for walking Newport with me by candlelight from the first gate to the last. Sleep well. Good night.